My name is Beatrice Holloway, and I am now what you might call a tenured professor, a woman whose name is associated with certain foundational texts in medieval linguistics. But when I was 21, I was just a student at Girton College, one of the first women's colleges at Cambridge, and my entire world was a battlefield of ink and parchment. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about my career. It's about how uncovering the most audacious academic scandal of my generation forced me to join forces with my greatest adversary, Julian Devereux. It's the story of how our bitter rivalry, a clash of intellects that echoed through the stone halls of the university, caught fire and became something else entirely, something that would redefine both our lives. The hallowed traditions of Cambridge were built on a foundation of truth, but that foundation was cracking, and the tremors started with a single, impossible word in a forgotten manuscript. Before I dive into the hushed libraries and whispered conspiracies of that autumn, I want to ask you something. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from in the world today. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel, and if you've ever had to work with someone you couldn't stand, go ahead and hit that like button. For all the new viewers here, make sure you subscribe, because this is a community for people who know that sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought in quiet places. The air in Cambridge in the late 19th century was thick with more than just the damp chill rolling in off the fens. It was thick with history, with ambition, and with the invisible, unyielding weight of tradition. For the men of King's or Trinity, this tradition was a plush armchair, something to sink into. For us, the women of Girton, it was a high wall we were perpetually trying to scale. We lived and studied a good 2 miles from the heart of the university, a distance that felt both physical and symbolic. We were an experiment, a tolerated anomaly, and we knew that every word we spoke in a lecture, every paper we submitted, was judged not just on its own merit, but as a reflection on our entire sex. The pressure was immense, a constant thrum beneath the surface of our lives. My refuge was the library. I found solace in the scent of aging paper and leather, in the meticulous, beautiful logic of language as it evolved through time. My field was Anglo-Saxon literature, the intricate knotwork of Old English. I was under the tutelage of Professor Alistair Finch, a man with a kind, crinkly smile and a reputation for nurturing new talent. He was one of the few senior academics who had publicly supported the establishment of Girton, and for that we revered him. He saw potential in me, he said, a rare instinct for the deep currents of linguistic history. I clung to his praise like a lifeline. And then there was Julian Devereux. He was not a person so much as a phenomenon. A King's College scholar in the classics, he was everything we at Girton were not, confident to the point of arrogance, celebrated without reservation, and an insider in the ancient, exclusive world of Cambridge scholarship. His name was a constant presence, a prize he had won, a dazzling translation he had published, a cutting remark he had made at a dinner that was repeated with admiring chuckles for weeks. He was brilliant, no one denied it, but his brilliance was a weapon, and he wielded it without mercy. I had seen him do it in shared lectures, dismantling another student's argument with a few lazy surgical words, a bored smirk playing on his lips. He was the gilded embodiment of the system I was fighting so hard just to exist within. I despised him on principle long before he ever knew my name. Our first direct encounter was at a small intercollegiate symposium on philology. It was a rare opportunity for a Girton student to present, and I had been chosen. I had spent months on my paper, a detailed analysis of a Northumbrian gloss in the Lindisfarne Gospels. I argued that a specific verb form, previously thought to be a simple scribal error, was in fact a deliberate, regional colloquialism, a ghost of a dialect that had otherwise vanished. It was a small point, but it was mine. My hands trembled as I stood at the lectern in the stuffy wood-paneled room, my voice feeling thin and reedy against the heavy silence. The audience was mostly male, a sea of dark jackets and skeptical expressions. Professor Finch gave me an encouraging nod from the front row. I made it through the presentation, my heart pounding against my ribs. I laid out my evidence, tracing the etymological threads, comparing the syntax to other, more obscure fragments. When I finished, there was a polite, lukewarm smattering of applause. The moderator, a dry, elderly man from Caius College, peered over his spectacles. "Any questions for Miss Holloway?" A hand went up in the third row. It was him, Julian Devereux. He didn't wait to be called upon. He rose slowly, a languid, almost insolent grace in his movements. He was handsome in a way that was infuriating, with dark, unruly hair and eyes that seemed to hold a kind of weary amusement at the world's expense. "A fascinating piece of imaginative reconstruction, Miss Holloway," he began, his voice smooth and carrying. The word imaginative was a carefully chosen poison dart. You build a rather towering edifice on the foundation of a single, ambiguous mark of ink. Have you considered the far more probable, if less romantic, explanation? That it is, in fact, exactly what it appears to be: a mistake, an exhausted monk, a flickering candle, a slip of the quill, Occam's razor, you know. The room hummed with quiet agreement. He had, in 2 sentences, framed my meticulous research as feminine fantasy, a schoolgirl's daydream. He wasn't just questioning my conclusion, he was questioning my entire methodology, my right to even be at that lectern. My face burned. I could feel the blood rising in my cheeks, a hot tide of humiliation and fury. I gripped the sides of the lectern to steady my hands. "Mr. Devereux," I said, my voice tighter than I wanted, "I did consider that possibility. It is, in fact, the first possibility any serious scholar would consider. However, as I explained on page 4 of my handout, the slip of the quill, as you call it, is repeated in a similar context in 2 other manuscripts from the same scriptorium. To dismiss it as mere error is to ignore a pattern, and ignoring patterns is, in my opinion, the very definition of intellectual laziness." A few people shifted in their seats. A low murmur went through the room. I had pushed back. Julian's smirk didn't falter, but something flickered in his eyes. A flicker of surprise, perhaps even a sliver of respect, quickly extinguished. "A pattern of 3 mistakes, perhaps," he countered smoothly. "Consistency in error does not create a truth." "Thank you, a very spirited defense." He sat down, the dismissal in his tone absolute. The moment was over. He had won. The rest of the questions were perfunctory. No one else dared to challenge him or support me. Afterward, Professor Finch patted my arm. "Don't you mind him, Beatrice," he said, his smile kind. "Devereux enjoys the sound of his own voice. Your paper was very well argued, a credit to Jerton." But his praise felt hollow, like a bandage on a gaping wound. He hadn't defended me. He had watched as I was intellectually vivisected, and then offered a polite platitude. Later, back in my small room at Jerton, my colleagues tried to comfort me. "He's just an arrogant pig," one said. "You were wonderful," said another. They were kind, but they didn't understand. It wasn't just about his arrogance. It was about the cold, hard fact that in that room, his opinion, offered with casual disdain, carried more weight than my months of painstaking research. It was a microcosm of our entire existence at Cambridge. That night, I didn't feel like a scholar, I felt like an imposter. And the name Julian Devereux was etched into my mind, not with ink, but with acid. My work with Professor Finch was the center of my academic life. It was a tremendous honor when he asked me to assist him with a project of great significance: the transcription and analysis of the Caulfield Manuscript, a recently acquired Anglo-Saxon text that promised to shed new light on pre-conquest legal codes. The parchment was brittle, the ink faded, but to me, it was a treasure chest, For weeks, I spent every available hour in a small, dusty carrel in the university library, my eyeglass pressed close to the page, deciphering the delicate, spidery script. Finch was a demanding but seemingly appreciative mentor. He would stop by my desk, peer at my progress, and murmur things like, "Excellent, Beatrice. Your eye for detail is remarkable." Each word of praise was a balm to the wound Devereaux had inflicted. I was proving myself. I was doing important work. It was during one of these long, solitary sessions, deep into the manuscript's third folio, that I found it. It was a single phrase, embedded in a long passage about land inheritance. The main text was pure, classical Old English. But this phrase, a short gloss in the margin, written in what looked like the same hand, was in Latin. That wasn't unusual. Marginalia were common. But the Latin itself was wrong. It was the syntax, the particular arrangement of the subjunctive clause. It felt modern. Not 19th century modern, but it had a whiff of Renaissance humanism, a certain grammatical flourish that felt centuries out of place in a document supposedly from the 10th century. It was like finding a cog from a pocket watch inside a Roman amphora. It was a tiny, jarring note in an otherwise perfect symphony. My first thought was that I was mistaken. I was a specialist in Germanic languages, not Latin. Perhaps I was misremembering a rule of classical grammar. I spent 2 days checking every resource I could find, from Priscian to the latest German treatises on medieval Latin. Everything confirmed my initial instinct. The phrasing was anachronistic. My heart began to beat a little faster. It was a discovery, a small one, perhaps, but a genuine puzzle. The kind of academic mystery I lived for. The next time Professor Finch visited my carrel, I showed it to him, my finger tracing the faint letters on the page. "Professor," I said, my voice filled with a nervous excitement, "I believe I've found something rather peculiar here. This Latin gloss. The construction is highly irregular for the period." He bent closer, his spectacles slipping down his nose. He squinted at the phrase, his brow furrowed. I expected him to be intrigued, to see the same puzzle I did. Instead, a strange expression crossed his face. It was a flicker of something sharp, almost irritated, before it was smoothed over by his usual benevolent smile. "Ah, yes," he said, straightening up. "A simple scribe's error, my dear. You'll find them all the time. The monasteries weren't always staffed by the finest classicists. Good of you to spot it, of course, shows you're paying attention. But don't let it distract you. It's a footnote, nothing more. The real meat is in the main text. Focus on that." His dismissal was so quick, so absolute. It wasn't a discussion, it was a command. I felt a prickle of disappointment, of foolishness. "But Professor," I pressed gently, "it's the nature of the error. It's not just bad Latin. It's anachronistically sophisticated Latin. It's as if the scribe made a mistake by being too clever, too modern." His smile tightened. "Beatrice," he said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. "You have a wonderful imagination. It's what makes you such a sensitive reader of poetry. But we must be careful not to build castles in the air. It is an error, a curious one perhaps, but an error nonetheless. Now how is the transcription of the land-grant section coming along?" He had already moved on, his attention fixed on the larger, safer parts of the manuscript. The conversation was over. I felt like a child who had been told her monster under the bed was just a shadow. I was embarrassed, chagrined. He was the expert, the celebrated professor. I was just a student from the women's college. I tried to put it out of my mind, to follow his instructions and focus on the main text, but I couldn't. His reaction hadn't felt like a scholarly correction. It had felt like a door being slammed in my face. It was too quick, too dismissive. It felt defensive. The tiny, impossible Latin phrase was no longer just a puzzle. It was a burr under my skin. a question that I couldn't let go of, no matter how much my own mentor told me to. I began to work on it in secret after my official work for him was done, stealing hours late at night when the library was quiet and empty, fueled by a growing, unsettling feeling that Professor Finch wasn't just mistaken, he was hiding something. Across the river, in the grand cathedral-like confines of King's College, Julian Devereux was facing his own crisis of faith. He was the star pupil of Professor Graham Caldwell, a man who was less a professor and more an institution. Caldwell was a titan of classical studies, a scholar whose pronouncements were treated as gospel. To be Caldwell's protégé was to be anointed, to have one's future gilded and assured. Julian had spent his entire Cambridge career basking in the reflected glory of his mentor, his own prodigious talent amplified by Caldwell's patronage. His current project was the pinnacle of this collaboration, translating the Caldwell Fragments, a collection of supposedly newly discovered Latin poems from the Augustan age, unearthed by Caldwell himself during a trip to Italy. The academic world was buzzing. Julian's translations were already being hailed as a work of genius, fluid and evocative, capturing the spirit of the lost originals. Julian, for his part, loved the work. He lived for the intricate dance of meter and meaning, the challenge of breathing English life into ancient verse. But as he worked on the final fragment, a melancholic ode to a lost love, something pricked at the back of his mind. It was a matter of scansion, the rhythm of the line. The poem used a specific sequence of dactyls and spondees, a metrical pattern that felt off. It was elegant, undeniably, but it was the elegance of a later period. It reminded him more of the Neo-Latin poets of the Renaissance than the Golden Age masters Caldwell claimed as the source. He spent a week checking, cross-referencing, convinced he was making a foolish mistake, but the evidence was irrefutable. The meter was anachronistic. Unlike me, Julian had no fear of approaching his mentor. He was used to being praised for his sharp eye. He found Professor Caldwell in his cavernous, book-lined study, a fire crackling in the hearth. "Professor," Julian began, a triumphant note in his voice, "I've found the most extraordinary thing in the final fragment. A metrical anomaly. The pattern is almost certainly post-classical. Isn't it fascinating? It suggests a much more complex provenance for the text." He expected Caldwell to lean forward, intrigued, to praise his intellectual rigor. Instead, the old man's face hardened. A deep, angry flush crept up his neck. An anomaly? Caldwell's voice was dangerously quiet. "Or a failure of your own understanding, Mr. Devereux?" Julian was taken aback. "No, Professor. I've checked exhaustively. The use of the caesura in the third foot, combined with the final Adonic, it's simply not found in any extant work from that period. I'm certain of it." Caldwell slammed a heavy book down on his desk. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "You are certain, are you? A boy of 22. Certain that he knows more than I? You who have built your entire reputation on my work, on my discoveries, you come in here and accuse me, not in so many words, but the implication is clear, of being either a fool or a fraud." The attack was so sudden, so vicious, it stole the air from Julian's lungs. "Professor, I would never. I only meant to point out an interesting scholarly detail." "You meant to undermine me," Caldwell roared, his face contorted with a terrifying rage. "You are arrogant, boy. Your talent has made you complacent and conceited. You see conspiracies in shadows because you wish to make a name for yourself by tearing down your betters. Let me be perfectly clear. You will finish the translation as assigned. You will not speak of this anomaly to anyone. You will forget this delusion. If I hear so much as a whisper that you are questioning the authenticity of my fragments, I will personally see to it that you never work in academia in this country or any other. Your career will be over before it has begun. Do you understand me?" Julian stood, frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. This was not the mentor he knew. This was a stranger, a furious, threatened tyrant. The certainty in Caldwell's eyes was gone, replaced by a wild, desperate glare. In that moment, Julian's own certainty, the bedrock of his world, crumbled into dust. He had come in with a puzzle. He was leaving with a threat. He stammered a quiet, "Yes, Professor," and retreated from the room, the old man's furious breathing following him down the hall. He walked back to his rooms in a daze, the beautiful Latin verses of the fragments now feeling like ashes in his mouth. He had been told to forget a delusion, but a terrifying new thought was taking root in his mind. What if it wasn't a delusion at all? What if the celebrated Caldwell fragments were a lie? I couldn't abandon the mystery of the Latin gloss. Professor Finch's dismissive words echoed in my mind, but they only served to harden my resolve. If he wouldn't help me, I would find the answer myself. My evenings became a secret second life. After spending my days dutifully transcribing the main text of the Caulfield Manuscript, I would retreat to the darkest, most forgotten corner of the university library, a place where no one would think to look for a student from Girton. I was on a ghost hunt, chasing a grammatical specter through centuries of academic texts. The phrase itself was innocuous, iuxta tunerum recentiorium, according to the more recent style. It was the recentiorium that bothered me, its specific usage feeling jarringly self-aware. My research led me down increasingly obscure paths. I waded through dense theological debates, legal commentaries, and forgotten treatises on manuscript illumination. And then, I found it. It was in a slim, dusty volume, a collection of essays from a minor academic journal published some 20 years prior. The essay was titled, "The Forger's Signature: Anachronism as Intentional Fallibility." It was a brilliant, if eccentric, piece of scholarship, arguing that the most sophisticated forgers in history didn't strive for absolute perfection. Instead, they would often embed a tiny, deliberate anachronism, a secret signature, visible only to those with the deepest knowledge, as a private mark of their own genius. The author described several historical examples, and then proposed a theoretical new one. A forger of a medieval text might use a piece of Latin syntax that was subtly, almost imperceptibly, humanistic. My blood ran cold. I read the sentence again. The author had used a hypothetical example that was hauntingly similar to the structure of the phrase in my manuscript. I looked at the author's name. It was a name I didn't recognize, published out of a small provincial university. But at the bottom of the page, in the author's biography, was a single devastating line. The author wishes to acknowledge the invaluable feedback of his then tutor, Mr. Graham Caldwell of King's College, Cambridge. Caldwell, Julian Devereux's mentor, the Titan. The piece of the puzzle fell into place with a sickening thud. This wasn't a random scribe's error. This was a technique, a forgery method. And Professor Caldwell, the most respected classicist at the university, was an expert on it. Why would a forgery technique he had studied appear in a manuscript being championed by his colleague, Professor Finch? The implication was monstrous. It suggested a level of collusion, of deep, premeditated fraud that was almost unthinkable. I felt a wave of dizziness. I was a student, a woman. Who would ever believe me? Accusing Professor Finch, a beloved benefactor of women's education, on the basis of a 20-year-old essay and a single phrase. I would be laughed out of Cambridge. I would destroy not only my own future, but could potentially damage Girton's fragile reputation. But I couldn't let it go. The truth mattered. I needed help. I needed someone who wouldn't just dismiss me, someone with the standing, and more importantly, the classical expertise to understand the Latin nuance. Someone who wasn't part of Finch's inner circle. The list of potential candidates was horrifyingly short. In fact, it contained only one name, a name that tasted like bile in my mouth, Julian Devereux. He was Caldwell's protégé, which was a risk, but he was also the sharpest classicist I knew, and if anyone could confirm or deny the significance of the Latin, It was him. And I reasoned with a grim sort of logic. If he was in on the fraud, his reaction would tell me everything I needed to know. Swallowing every last ounce of my pride, I planned my approach. I couldn't simply knock on the door of his King's College rooms. I had to make it look like a chance encounter, a purely academic query. I spent the next afternoon lurking near the entrance to the university library. My heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Finally, I saw him leaving, a satchel of books slung over his shoulder. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into his path. "Mr. Devereux," I said, my voice commendably steady. He stopped, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized me. "Miss Holloway," he said, his tone cool and faintly amused. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Come to lecture me on scribal patterns again?" The casual arrogance of it almost made me turn and walk away. I forced myself to stand my ground. "I have a question for you," I said, keeping my tone clipped and professional. "A matter of Latin syntax. It is outside my area of expertise, and I was told you were the foremost authority among the junior scholars. A little flattery, I thought, might grease the wheels." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "Is that so? Very well. I can spare a moment. What is this grammatical conundrum?" We stood there, in the cavernous, echoing portico of the library, the stone figures of kings and bishops gazing down at us. I took out my notebook and showed him my transcription of the phrase. "This was found in the margin of a 10th century manuscript," I explained, carefully omitting any mention of Professor Finch or the Caulfield manuscript. "The subjunctive construction here, it seems incorrect to me, almost performative." He glanced at it, his expression dismissive. "A moment," he had said, but he seemed prepared to give it only a second. "It's slightly clumsy, but hardly impossible. Probably a later gloss from a monk with a pretentious streak. A scribe's error, Miss Holloway. It happens." There it was. The exact same phrase Finch had used. A scribe's error. But I was ready. "Is it?" I countered, my voice sharp. "Or is it a deliberate, anachronistic flourish, consistent with humanistic, rather than classical or medieval syntax? A construction that calls attention to its own modernity, even as it pretends to be ancient?" He looked up from the notebook, his condescending air faltering for the first time. He looked at me properly, seeing not just the girl from Girton he had humiliated at a symposium, but a fellow scholar with an argument. "That's a rather bold claim," he said slowly, his eyes going back to the page. "It gets bolder," I said, pressing my advantage. I told him about the obscure journal article, about the theory of the forger's signature. I told him about the author's acknowledgement of Professor Caldwell. I laid out the trail of breadcrumbs, my voice low and urgent. As I spoke, his entire demeanor changed. The arrogance drained away, replaced by an intense, unnerving stillness. The color seeped from his face. He wasn't looking at me with amusement anymore. He was looking at me with a dawning horror that perfectly mirrored my own. When I finished, the silence between us was heavy, profound. He knew. I could see it in his eyes. He knew something. "My God," he whispered, more to himself than to me. He looked around as if worried the very stones were listening. "Come with me, not here." He grabbed my elbow, his touch surprisingly firm, and steered me away from the library, out into the winding, narrow streets of the town. He led me to a small, grimy pub, the kind frequented by porters and groundsmen, not scholars. He found an empty booth in the back, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and sawdust. We sat opposite each other, the notebook with the incriminating phrase lying between us like a loaded pistol. "The Caldwell fragments," he said, his voice barely audible. "The poems my professor discovered." And then he told me everything. He told me about the flawed meter, the nagging feeling that the verses were too perfect, too clean. He described the confrontation in Caldwell's study, the terrifying disproportionate rage, the threats to his career. His story was the other half of mine. My impossible Latin phrase and his impossible poetic meter weren't two separate problems. They were two signatures on the same forged document. We sat there for what felt like an hour, piecing it together in hushed, frantic whispers. Caldwell, the master classicist and theorist of forgery, and Finch, the respected Anglo-Saxonist. One supplied the impeccable yet subtly flawed classical texts, and the other supplied the authentic Anglo-Saxon manuscripts to house them. They were creating discoveries, manufacturing history. Their reputations, their careers, were built on a colossal, breathtaking lie. The scale of it was dizzying, and we, two junior scholars who were barely on speaking terms, were the only ones who had seen behind the curtain. "What do we do?" I asked, the weight of the question settling on us both. Julian ran a hand through his hair, his usual composure completely gone. "If we accuse them, we need more than a theory. We need incontrovertible proof. They're titans, we're gnats. They'll crush us without a second thought. Our word against theirs, it's no contest." He was right. We were powerless, but we were also in possession of a truth so explosive it could rock the university to its foundations. He looked at me, his eyes dark with a new, unwelcome understanding. "We can't trust anyone," he said. "Not our mentors, not our department heads, no one." A strange, unspoken understanding passed between us. We were adversaries from different worlds, with every reason to dislike and distrust one another. But in that moment, we were the only two people in the world who shared this terrible secret. Our rivalry had led us, by a twisted path, to the same precipice. "So we work together," I said, making it a statement, not a question. He nodded slowly, a grim look on his face. "In secret, absolute secrecy, no one can know we're even speaking to each other." He extended a hand across the sticky table. "A pact?" I looked at his hand, then back at his face. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability I found startling. I saw not the celebrated golden boy, but a young man as frightened and outraged as I was. I took his hand. His grip was strong and warm. "A pact," I agreed. Our fingers remained linked for a moment longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement of the dangerous, unwilling alliance we had just forged. Our collaboration began in fits and starts, a clandestine dance of suspicion and necessity. We met in places we were unlikely to be seen together, a remote bench in the botanical gardens, the echoing nave of a little-used church, or walking along the muddy banks of the River Granta, far from the bustling town center. Every interaction was a negotiation, a careful balancing act. Our old dynamic of intellectual combat was still there, but now it was directed at the problem, not at each other. He would challenge my theories, forcing me to refine them. I would pick apart his assumptions, forcing him to find better evidence. "That's sentimental conjecture, Holloway," he'd say, pointing to a line in my notes. "We need logic, not intuition." I'd retort, "And your logic is useless without the details, Devereaux. You leap to conclusions without checking the foundation." It was infuriating, and it was exhilarating. For the first time in my life, I had an intellectual equal, someone who didn't condescend to me or praise me with empty platitudes, but who met my mind with the full force of his own. A grudging respect, hard-won and undeniable, began to grow in the space between our arguments. Our first task was to find more definitive proof of their collaboration. It wasn't enough to know they were friends. We needed to link them to the act of forgery itself. Julian remembered Finch and Caldwell being mentioned as founding members of a small, exclusive philological society, back when they were junior fellows. It was a long shot, but we decided to search for the society's records. That led us on a week-long hunt through the university's labyrinthine archives, a place of dust motes dancing in slivers of light, and the rustle of turning pages. We had to work separately, communicating through coded notes left in a hollowed-out book in a forgotten aisle. He would search the King's College archives. I would search the Central University Library. It was I who found it, tucked away in a mislabeled box of university club charters. The Society's minute book. It was mostly tedious records of meetings and papers presented. But in the records for one winter, nearly 25 years ago, I found a series of entries that made my breath catch. The minutes detailed a heated multi-week debate between G. Caldwell and A. Finch on the subject of textual authenticity. Caldwell, the minutes recorded, argued that a perfectly executed replica, indistinguishable from the original, held its own kind of scholarly value. Finch, in response, argued for the moral dimension of the artifact, insisting on the sanctity of the original. Then, the final entry on the topic read, "Mr. Caldwell and Mr. Finch have informed the Society that they have resolved their philosophical differences and will be presenting a joint paper on reconstructive philology at a future date." There was no record that the paper was ever presented. They had taken their collaboration private. It was circumstantial, but it was a powerful link, showing they had been obsessed with this very topic together for decades. The real breakthrough, however, came from the journal article I had first discovered, the one on the forger's signature. The author was listed with only his initial and surname. On a hunch, Julian and I started a new line of inquiry. Who was this mysterious scholar? We reasoned that if he was a student of Caldwell's, he would have been at Cambridge. We spent 2 painstaking days poring over the university's matriculation records from that period. And we found him, a brilliant student who had left Cambridge abruptly, without taking his degree, citing personal reasons. We needed to find him. Julian used his family's connections in London to track down a forwarding address. It was old, but it was a start. He wrote a carefully worded letter pretending to be a scholar researching Caldwell's early influence and asking for an interview. We waited for a week that felt like a year. Finally, a reply came. The man was now a recluse, a country vicar in a forgotten corner of Norfolk. He agreed to a meeting. The journey itself felt momentous. We took the train together, sitting opposite each other in a third-class carriage. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels a nervous counterpoint to the pounding of my own heart. It was the first time we had spent so much time together in public, and I felt a strange sense of both trepidation and rightness. The easy way he spoke, the quick, intelligent spark in his eyes when he listened to me, it was a world away from the arrogant peacock I had first met. We were no longer just allies. We were becoming friends. The vicarage was a damp, crumbling stone house overgrown with ivy. The vicar himself was a broken man, with haunted eyes and hands that trembled. At first he was cagey, speaking of Caldwell with a kind of fearful reverence. But as Julian gently prodded, and as I laid out my own discovery of the Latin gloss, something in him cracked. The story came pouring out. He had been Caldwell's star student, much like Julian. Together, they had developed the theory of the forger's signature. But Caldwell, he explained, hadn't seen it as a mere theory. He saw it as a tool. He, along with his close friend Alistair Finch, had pressured the young man to participate in creating a perfect forgery, a test of their theories. He refused, horrified by the ethical breach. The pressure became immense. Caldwell and Finch threatened him, accused him of academic theft, and made it clear his career was over if he didn't cooperate or if he spoke out. Broken and terrified, he had simply disappeared, abandoning his life's ambition. They were creating a legacy. The vicar whispered, his voice trembling, with a quarter-century of suppressed rage and grief. They believed their own genius gave them the right to improve upon history. He had no physical proof to give us, nothing but his story. But his story gave us the final piece of the puzzle, motive. It wasn't about money, it was about ego. The colossal, ravenous ego of 2 men who believed they were smarter than history itself. As we left the vicarage and walked back to the station under a gray, drizzling sky, a profound silence fell between us. The human cost of the fraud was now real to us. Julian looked shaken to his core. This was the man whose path he was on, whose patronage he had courted. He had seen a terrifying ghost of his own future. He stopped walking and turned to me. "Beatrice," he said, his voice raw. "They can't get away with this. I don't care what it costs. We have to expose them." In that moment, the last vestiges of our rivalry burned away, consumed by a shared, righteous fire. We knew we had to find the workshop. The vicar's testimony confirmed that the forgeries were physical creations, requiring tools, inks, and parchment. They couldn't be crafting them in their college rooms. It had to be somewhere private, somewhere secure. Julian, dredging his memory for every conversation he'd ever had with Caldwell, recalled the professor frequently boasting about his weekend cottage in Ely, a place where he could escape the endless distractions of Cambridge to do his most focused work. It was a long shot, but it was the only one we had. The plan was audacious, bordering on insane. There was a public lecture on church architecture being held in Ely Cathedral that Saturday. We would take the train, ostensibly to attend the lecture, a plausible excuse should anyone ask. Then we would slip away and find the cottage. We had no address, only a vague description from Julian that it was near the river with a view of the cathedral's western tower. We would have to trust that we could find it and that it would be empty. The risk was enormous. If we were caught, it wouldn't be academic ruin. It would be criminal charges, trespassing, burglary. The train ride to Ely was fraught with a tense, almost unbearable silence. We were both acutely aware of the line we were about to cross. We weren't just researchers anymore. We were becoming conspirators, criminals in the service of the truth. When we arrived, we walked through the small market town, the immense stone cathedral looming over us like a silent judge. Following Julian's memory, we found a path that led down towards the river, past a row of small, quiet houses, and then we saw it, a small, isolated stone cottage set back from the path, with a slate roof and a small, overgrown garden. And from its front gate, the western tower of the cathedral was perfectly framed. It had to be the place. My heart was in my throat. The cottage was silent, the windows dark. There was no sign of life. After watching it for 20 minutes from the cover of a thicket of trees, we decided to act. Julian, surprisingly adept, found a poorly secured window at the back of the house. With a sickening creak of wood, he pried it open. "After you," he whispered, his attempt at gallantry feeling absurd under the circumstances. I clambered through, my skirts catching on the latch, and dropped onto the cold stone floor inside. He followed a moment later, pulling the window shut behind him. We were in a small, musty kitchen. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and chemicals. We moved through the small downstairs rooms, our footsteps echoing in the silence. It was all disappointingly normal. A sitting room, a dining area. Then, Julian pointed to a heavy wooden door at the end of a short hallway. It was locked. Not with a simple latch, but with a heavy modern padlock. This was it. Using a poker from the fireplace, Julian worked at the hasp, sweat beading on his forehead. With a final loud crack, the wood splintered and the door swung open. The room was a workshop. It was meticulously organized. On one wall were shelves of jars containing pigments and gums. On another, tools. Quills of every size, knives, burnishers, presses. A long workbench stood in the center of the room, and on it lay sheets of parchment in various stages of being aged, some soaking in trays of what looked like tea, others stretched taut on frames. It was the lair of a master craftsman. And then we saw the lockbox, a large iron-bound chest tucked under the workbench. It too was locked. This time, there was no breaking it. Desperate, We searched the room for a key, tucked away on a high shelf, behind a row of books on medieval chemistry. We found it, a small, ornate iron key. Julian's hands trembled as he fitted it into the lock. It turned. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside, our breath caught in a simultaneous gasp. It was the motherlode. Drafts. Dozens of them. Practice versions of the Caldwell fragments, with notes in Caldwell's spidery handwriting correcting the meter. Pages from the Caulfield Manuscript, with Finch's blocky script penciling in notes on vocabulary and syntax. And, most damning of all, a series of letters between the two men, openly discussing the project, the artifice, and the gullibility of our esteemed colleagues. They debated which anachronisms to use, congratulating each other on their cleverness. It was all there. The entire conspiracy, laid out in their own words, in their own hands. It was the smoking gun. It was absolute, irrefutable proof. We began grabbing handfuls of the most incriminating documents, stuffing them into my large satchel. We had to get out, quickly. We had what we needed. And that's when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of carriage wheels crunching on the gravel of the path outside. A cold, stark terror seized me. My blood turned to ice. Julian swore, a single sharp word. We looked at each other, our eyes wide with panic. A shadow fell across the front window. A key was turning in the lock of the front door. It was Caldwell. He had come a day early. There was no time to think. Julian grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the back of the cottage. We scrambled out the way we had come, through the kitchen window, not daring to look back. We didn't stop running until we were deep in the woods that bordered the river, our lungs burning, my satchel banging painfully against my side. We hid in a ditch, concealed by ferns, as we heard Caldwell's angry shouts from the cottage. He had clearly found the broken door to his workshop. We stayed hidden, not daring to breathe, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, when the woods fell silent again, we made our way back to the station, taking a winding, circuitous route, terrified at every shadow. We didn't speak on the train ride back to Cambridge. We sat in a stunned, adrenaline-fueled silence, the satchel of stolen documents, a heavy, dangerous weight on the seat between us. The shared danger, the frantic escape, had stripped away every last pretense. As the train rattled through the darkening fenland, I looked at Julian. His face was pale and smudged with dirt, his hair a mess, but his eyes, when they met mine, were blazing. The intellectual fire I had always seen in him was still there, but it was tempered now by something else, something deeper. When the train finally pulled into the station at Cambridge, the relief was so overwhelming it felt like a physical blow. We walked out into the cool night air, the familiar streets of the city now seeming alien, as if we were returning from a foreign war. He walked me to the path that led to Girton. Under the faint gaslight of a street lamp, he stopped. "Beatrice," he began, his voice rough with emotion, and then he couldn't seem to find any more words. He just looked at me, his gaze intense and searching, and in that moment, the immense, unbearable tension of the day, the fear, the triumph, the shared secret, snapped. He reached out, his hand cupping my cheek, and drew me in. His kiss was not gentle or tentative, it was desperate, passionate, a raw and overwhelming expression of everything that had passed between us. It was the collision of two worlds, the frantic release of a pressure that had been building since the day we first met. In the shadow of the ancient university that we had just upended, our rivalry finally, irrevocably, transformed into something else entirely. The morning after the break-in was a strange, disorienting new world. The satchel of documents sat on the floor of my small room at Girton, a ticking bomb. The memory of the kiss, of Julian's lips on mine, was a searing brand on my consciousness. Everything was different. When we met that afternoon, by the river, the awkwardness between us was a palpable thing. The easy antagonism, the sharp intellectual sparring that had defined us, was gone. replaced by a shy, uncertain tenderness. We were no longer just co-conspirators. We were something else. And we had a decision to make. "What do we do now?" I asked, breaking the silence. "We have the proof, absolute proof." Julian stared out at the slow-moving water, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. His usual confidence seemed to have deserted him, replaced by a heavy sobriety. "The right thing to do is to take it to the university senate," he said, his voice flat. "Present the evidence. Let them handle it." He turned to me, a deep conflict in his eyes. "I want to see their faces when we do it. I want to watch Caldwell's world burn down around him. My pride demands it." I understood his impulse. A part of me wanted that too. The public vindication, the satisfaction of watching our tormentors fall. But I saw the bigger picture, the collateral damage. "And what happens then, Julian?" I countered gently. "A scandal of this magnitude, it won't just destroy them. It will tarnish the entire university. And it will hit Girton the hardest. They'll say it was the woman scholar, the one who shouldn't have been here in the first place, who brought this shame upon them. They'll use it as an excuse, proof that allowing women into academia was a mistake. Finch was our great champion. His disgrace will become ours. We can't risk that." He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw his perspective shift. He was seeing the world through my eyes, understanding the precariousness of my position, of my entire college's existence. He had always lived in a world that was built for him. I had always lived in one I had to fight for a place in. "You're right," he said, his voice quiet with a new understanding. "Your college, its reputation is more fragile. It's not fair, but it's true. So a public confrontation is out." We spent hours talking, debating, weighing the options. It was the most important conversation of our lives, and it wasn't an argument, it was a true collaboration. He listened to my fears for Girton, and I listened to his desire for justice. We were a team, building a strategy together, our minds working in concert. We finally landed on a plan that was both radical and, we thought, surgical. A plan that would destroy the guilty parties while protecting the institution as much as possible. We would not go to the Senate, we would not become the public faces of the scandal. Instead, we would become anonymous agents of the truth. That evening, we worked by candlelight in my room, a space he never should have been allowed in. We carefully selected the most damning pieces of evidence. One of Caldwell's letters explicitly detailing the forgery, a draft page from the Caulfield manuscript with Finch's notes, and one of the practice fragments of the ancient poems. We made meticulous copies of everything. Then, together, we composed a letter. It was unsigned, written in a disguised hand. It laid out the fraud in cold, clear, undeniable detail, explaining the significance of each piece of enclosed evidence. It was the best argued, most devastating piece of scholarship either of us had ever produced. The next morning, before the city was truly awake, we posted 3 identical packages. One was addressed to the editor of a major London newspaper, one known for its rigorous journalism and its willingness to challenge the establishment. The second went to the master of King's College. The third went to the mistress of Girton College. Then we waited. The silence of the next 2 days was the loudest I have ever known. Every footstep in the hall made me jump. Every glance from a fellow student felt like an accusation. Julian and I couldn't risk being seen together. We communicated only through a single, brief nod across a crowded lecture hall. It was an agony of suspense. And then, on the 3rd day, the bomb detonated. It broke first in the London papers. The headline was stark: "Scandal at Cambridge. Celebrated academics accused in massive forgery scheme." The story was a sensation. It was all anyone on campus could talk about. Students gathered in shocked, whispering groups. The dons were either tight-lipped and furious, or openly horrified. The university, caught completely off guard, was forced to respond to a public crisis, not an internal complaint. They couldn't bury it, they couldn't dismiss it. An emergency inquiry was announced within hours. Caldwell and Finch issued furious denials, calling the anonymous accusations a vicious and cowardly attack by a jealous rival. But the evidence, printed in facsimile in the newspaper, was irrefutable. Their own handwriting condemned them. We watched it all unfold from the sidelines, our secret a silent, powerful bond between us. We had done it. We had pulled down the pillars of the temple from the outside, and no one even knew our names. The fallout was swift and brutal. The university inquiry, under the harsh glare of the national press, was merciless. Faced with their own letters and drafts, both Caldwell and Finch confessed. They were stripped of their professorships, their publications were retracted, and their names were scrubbed from the rolls of honor. They became pariahs overnight, their decades of academic prestige dissolving into public shame. The university, desperate to contain the damage and demonstrate its commitment to integrity, moved quickly to clean house. The Caulfield Manuscript and the Caldwell fragments were declared forgeries and locked away in a vault, artifacts of disgrace. A few weeks after the scandal broke, I was summoned to the office of the mistress of Girton. My heart pounded as I walked across the lawn. Did she know? Had someone figured it out? The mistress was a formidable woman with a reputation for sternness, but her eyes when I entered her office were not accusatory. They were shrewd, knowing, and held a surprising warmth. "Miss Holloway," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "A terrible business this. Professor Finch, it is a deep wound for this college. He was a great friend to us." She paused, her gaze unwavering. The anonymous letter that was sent to me, the handwriting was disguised, but the intellectual style was not. It was sharp, meticulous, and deeply informed on the subject of Anglo-Saxon linguistics. It was the work of a first-rate mind. She didn't ask, she didn't need to. In the quiet of her office, an unspoken understanding passed between us. I had protected the college, and she knew it. "The board has just approved the creation of a new junior fellowship in philology," she continued, her voice formal again. "Given the sudden vacancy in the field, we feel it is imperative to foster new honorable scholarship. Your name was at the top of the list. We would be honored if you would accept. A fellowship, a paid academic position. For a woman at Cambridge, it was a near impossibility, a dream I hadn't dared to entertain for at least another decade. It was everything I had ever worked for. It was vindication, not handed to me by a patronizing mentor, but earned through my own secret, dangerous work. I accepted, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. Julian's path was different. The disgrace of his mentor, the man whose career he was meant to emulate, had soured him on the cloistered world of academia. He saw the rot beneath the gilded surface, the way ego and ambition could curdle into deceit. He completed his degree, finishing at the top of his class, of course, but he turned down the prestigious fellowships that were offered to him. "I need to do something real, Beatrice," he told me one afternoon as we sat on a bench, finally able to be seen together without fear. "Something other than arguing about the placement of a comma in a dead language. All that intellect, all that power, twisted into making forgeries. What a waste. I want to build something, not just critique what others have built." He had decided to take the civil service examinations, hoping for a post in the Foreign Office. It was a surprising choice, but it made sense. The world was bigger than the university library, and he was finally ready to see it. The last evening before he left for London, we took a punt out on the river. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the ancient stone colleges. The ugliness of the scandal seemed a world away. We drifted in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the gentle splash of the pole in the water. Our old rivalry felt like a story about two different people. The arrogant young man who had tried to humiliate me was gone, replaced by this thoughtful, self-aware man who held my hand as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The intimidated, insecure young woman I had been was also gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing my own worth. "It's funny," he said, breaking the silence. "If you hadn't found that ridiculous Latin phrase, none of this would have happened. I would have finished my translations, become Caldwell's successor, and probably grown into a thoroughly insufferable old man." I smiled. "And if you hadn't been so intolerably arrogant at that symposium, I might never have developed the spine I needed to question Professor Finch in the first place. So I suppose I should thank you for that." He laughed, a real, warm sound. "So you're saying my most obnoxious character flaw is responsible for your greatest triumph? I'll accept that." His expression softened. "We were good adversaries, Beatrice Holloway." "We're better partners, Julian Devereux," I replied. He leaned over and kissed me, a slow, sweet kiss filled with the promise of a future we would build together. A future forged not in the dusty quiet of an archive, but out in the bright, complicated world. He was leaving Cambridge, but he wasn't leaving me. Our story hadn't ended with the exposure of a crime. It was just beginning. Looking back now, all these years later, it's the quiet moments I remember most. The shared glance across a crowded library, the hushed excitement of a discovery whispered in a dark church, the comforting weight of his hand in mine. We exposed a great lie. Yes, but in doing so, we found a profound truth. We learned that integrity is a choice you have to actively make, and that true partnership is about more than just affection. It's about respect. It's about seeing the world through your partner's eyes and fighting for their battles as if they were your own. The world tried to pit us against each other, to make us rivals in a game where the rules were rigged, but we chose to write our own rules, together, and that has made all the difference. So I want to leave you with this thought. Sometimes, the people who challenge us the most are the ones who help us grow the most. And sometimes, the greatest love stories don't start with a glance across a crowded room, but with a furious argument over a footnote. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. I'd love to read your own stories in the comments below. Have you ever had a rival who became a friend, or even more? Your stories are what make this community so special. Don't forget to like this video if our story resonated with you, and please subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the most unexpected places. I hope this story inspires you to always question, to always seek the truth, and to never, ever let anyone make you feel small. Thank you for listening.